Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me to do this presentation today. I just want to talk about a few things. I want to talk a bit about the climate maths and put it in the context of how that may bring a lot of opportunity to the industry. And I'll touch on my contacts with Vera and the development of a methodology and a concept I have with central data collection of the whole value chain. Then to talk about the structure of the carbon offset market. So you get a little bit of an idea of who the players are and where you fit in. And then a look at what the sort of what's in it for farmers and builders when it comes to carbon offsets. And I just want to talk about another little project I'm working on called 1 Hectare, 1 Home. Firstly, if we look at the maths, currently the world emissions are 51 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions. We were meant to do 25 gigatons last year to stay on track. It looks like we're going to do another 51 gigatons this year. So, and in essence, we need to be doing only 24 or even less. So the point is that we are not going to stay at 1.5 degrees warming under that maths there. We're going to 2 degrees. And on the other side of the coin, if we add up the total amount of current offsets where you actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you get the grand total of 0.15 gigatons. And they're talking, there's a task force to scale up carbon offset programs to 2 gigatons by 2030. So, you know, if you look at the difference, we've got a glitch. And this is where it comes in with hemp. And this is why I started to get involved with it. Here we have a product that grows a lot more quickly than trees, and it can sequester a lot more carbon dioxide than trees. And it also, you know, what happened was about 2 or 3 years ago, I thought to myself, you know, why isn't there a carbon offset revolving around hemp, industrial hemp, and taking industrial hemp and taking the herd out of that and making that into hempcrete and permanently storing it. So, and I looked around and I realized that there wasn't a methodology, and a methodology is the document that sort of sets out all the rules, you know, how you credit, how much carbon's going to be allowed in carbon offsets, how you work out a thing called additionality, you know, like it's the carbon offsets are designed in theory that you wouldn't do this type of program because there's not enough money in it. Well, fortunately, we're able to get across that hurdle because they have a thing called a positive list, which talks about an industry being in its sort of infancy, if you will, or, you know, less than 5% of the market. And it was via this channel that I was able to submit an application to Vera to asking them to develop a methodology so that we could have one that could be applied on a worldwide basis. And along the way, I'm now joined with Green Collar. They're doing a marvelous job. And so we're working together, and we are very close, very close. It's taken a long time. We're very close to getting approval to go ahead with that methodology. If I just quickly show you a little bit of the structure of the market, it looks a bit confusing. I'm sure you'll get these slides will be shared with you, so you'll be able to look more closely later on. But if you look at that rectangular box at the top there with carbon standard organisations written in it, you'll see names like Vera, Gold Standard, and the Emissions Reduction Fund. And they are the standards. They're the people that set the rules. And then from there, they say, well, we go down to that box just below on the left-hand side, project proponents and or developers. And I've given an example there, Australian Integrated Carbon. I could have put Green Collar there as well. These are people that they're the developers, but the project proponents are very often the farmers themselves, or if we're talking about hempcrete, possibly it's going to be the manufacturers of the hempcrete itself, and we'll come back and revisit that particular point when we're talking about sharing out the revenue streams. So it's at that point here that where we want to see the farmers getting to understand that they have an opportunity here to, if they have the methodology, they have the chance to create carbon offsets, and then they then have an opportunity through, you'll see these various arrows, and I apologise for the confusion here, but you can see that there's big buyers and there's small buyers. And essentially what this industry would be looking to is to secure a lot of big buyers, your Googles, your Teslas, your Apples, to negotiate the pre-sale of these carbon offsets as you go along. So just to give you a bit of an idea, essentially you've got big buyers on the left and the small trading platforms on the right, which are also useful for smaller buyers. If I go to this diagram here, once again, it's sort of, it looks fairly complicated, but once you get the slides, you can go through it. But it's a snapshot of the value chain to make, in this case, hempcrete blocks, but it could be just to make hempcrete. And you can see over to the left there in the red ink, carbon emissions of seeding, fertilising, cultivation of the crop. And then you see in the green writing underneath on the left-hand corner there, the CO2 removed by sequestration. And this is, now we're getting interested. Then we've got transport emissions through to the decorticating machine. Then we've got emissions there, and we've got emissions through to the hempcrete manufacturer. We have an avoidance of emissions. If we're comparing this project boundary with the manufacturer, say concrete blocks, we have an avoidance here of emissions because the lime binder doesn't need to be taken to such a high temperature as the binder used in concrete. However, in the process with Vera, that particular part has not been included, and I'll come back to that. We then have carbon emissions, the actual construction of blocks, if it is, and then we go to the builder down the end there. And of course, when the hempcrete is put into place, there's ongoing carbonation, recovering the CO2 that was released on the chemical reaction in the making of the lime binder. So in terms of calculating how many carbon offsets there's going to be, it's a matter of saying, well, first I've got to figure out how much carbon sequestration there's going to be. And then from there, I'm going to have to take away emissions that are involved in making that carbon sequestration happen, so that you come up with a net figure for what you can raise. I proposed this concept to Vera. They said that it's probably too advanced for many countries in the world, but I still want to pursue it. It's where we have a central data platform, and everyone in the value chain, if you see on the left-hand top side there, the farmer is registered, their location is registered, where the decortication machine's registered, the distance between the two, we know the emissions per tonne of biomass from the decortication, and we can, and then right through the distance to the hempcrete manufacturer, right through to the actual builder themselves, so that we have every single player registered with distances, so we can calculate the emissions of transport, we can calculate all the emissions, and we have an exact amount. We can follow the biomass right through from farm to building. And the other thought I had was, apart from getting a more accurate reflection of the total impact, was this is something that could be available to the various regulatory bodies in Australia. And I can see each state has their own regulatory body, and it gets very confusing. To have something like this available so that they can allay their fears of any wrongdoing going on. The business case is, if you're looking at the total amount per hectare, in this case, the removals in terms of the photosynthesis, you're looking at about 11 tonne and about 6 tonne. So you're looking at about, to build, if you're looking at this as a house or something like that, or look at it per hectare, removals 11 tonne per hectare on average, depends on conditions, carbonation about 6 tonnes. In the next figures down where it says net removals, I've basically taken up the carbonation of the taking the herd out of the biomass, leaving 7 tonnes of removal dedicated to that, and the carbonation remains. So we're looking at in total at about, say, 13 tonne for the per hectare that you're going to end up with by the time you take away emissions and so forth to get the hempcrete into the building. So from the farmer's perspective, if they receive the benefit of the photosynthesis that's happened at their place, less their emissions, and this is going to be interesting, the emissions of the decorticator and the emissions of the hempcrete manufacturer, where should those emissions be allocated? For the purposes of this, I've allocated them all to one source, the farmer here, but that can be easily changed, and I'll come back to that in a minute. There's who is going to get the benefit out of all of this. Is really important to understand that. But I'll just go back to what I started off at the beginning of this presentation, and there's all these organisations in the world that are going, we're going to be net zero, and they don't realise the maths that I've just shown you before. And Bloomberg's have said that it's potentially possible that carbon offsets will go up to $200 US by 2030 because of all the governments and organisations that have, made these sort of targets and not realising what's going to happen. So what I've written in there is if the carbon offset was at $50, and I'm being nice because the current emissions reduction fund ACCUs are, I think, $37.50, but they're on the rise. We're looking at, say, $350 extra for the farmer per hectare. If it went to $200 Australian, we're looking at a much higher amount that would be available. There are some tax changes that have been made in the latest budget to do with the primary account and whether you use the offsets or you sell the offsets. So I believe, and I'm yet to study up on them, but I believe that if you actually use the offsets for your own purposes to make your own property net zero, there won't be a tax effect, but there will be if you sell them. But I go back to this diagram here, and the reason I do is I've been listening today to the various presentations. Not had to miss a couple of them, unfortunately, but I really got that message about the people pushing for standardisation. Colin's last presentation there was very informative. One of the things when I've been talking to Vera is they've got an issue, and this is why they keeps getting pushed back all the time. They'd rather go, if someone came along and said, yes, well, I've got this idea to do a methodology and it's to do with concrete and blah, 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 you'd have a lot better chance, because one of the problems they've got is, how do we know that there isn't going to be this thing called leakage? And when you look at that diagram here, the first place to go to is the right and side there with the builder, where the hempcrete goes into the building. And they're simply saying, how do you prove to us that that building isn't going to crumble? Do you have a building code? How do you justify, how do you prove to us that it is permanent storage? And of course, we've sent a lot of information across. I must thank James Vosper, I must thank Bob Doyle and Clara, and a lot of people that have contributed to helping with their information along the way. The other thing too that they've talked about in leakage here is down here in the little square down here, Barston fines delivered to approved end users. So they're saying, how do we know that the rest of the biomass, the fibre, doesn't end up going to landfill, which if it did, would turn into methane, which methane has what's called a global warming potential of 31. In other words, you put 1 tonne of methane up in the atmosphere, it's like putting up 31 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So, here, well, 1 step forward and 31 steps back sort of thing. So they want to see that there's a market, a defined market for the rest. And I've proposed to them that, possibly venturing down the biochar route, which would mean that there'd be more carbon offsets available because there is a methodology in place for biochar. So that's something to be followed up. And this crediting baseline term that I've got there is just about getting the accuracy and getting standardisation and systemisation of the processes. And what's been talked about today, I think I could summarise what I've heard today, is adding a level of sophistication to the whole discussion and the way it's proposed. Darren Christie mentioned something about having some sort of an institution that creates a regulation where you can, so that you've got a regulated industry where there's standards, and of course what Colin was talking about, and sharing information, so critical, and coming together to achieve that goal. And I think, it'll make it easier with all this carbon offset business, because bearing in mind, if I just go back a bit to this one, over here on the left, that little box there are the validators and verifiers. The validators are the people that validate that a project's ready to go right at the beginning. And then you've got verifiers that come in on a regular basis to check that whatever you said was happening is really happening. And this is where, once again, we want a streamlined system so that when the verification comes through, these are the things you've got to have in place and the processes that you should be doing. And sorry, I might be running out of time.
Just about.
Co-benefits. One of the things about carbon offsets, and this is why I sort of got interested in hemp in the first place, quite apart from all the benefits of the buildings and everything else, is the fact that, and quite apart from it's improving the soil, and in some cases can take out all the nasties out of the soil, it's creating employment. So there's a lot of offsets around that are dedicated to paying people not to cut forests down. Okay, fine, but what do those people do? And what I wanted to, with the hemp thing, we have an opportunity to create hemp hubs where in regional areas where you've got the decorticator, you've got the hempcrete blocks or the hempcrete manufacturers located in those areas, and you can create employment both on the farm and off in the local towns. And this is completely different to some of the criticism we're seeing with some of the offsets that are raised under the DIY process under the Emissions Reduction Fund. The other thing that hasn't been counted in all of this is the passive homes application of this. We're talking about an R7 home. The amount of electricity that's not going to have to be used. It meets, we're talking about the Sustainable Development Goals under the UN, which is very important now. When we're creating carbon offsets, there's a very big emphasis on co-benefits. This industry is in the right place at the right time. And finally, to finish off, I've got a project going, 1 hectare, 1 home, and I see I've made a little typo there, 1 hectare, 1 home. And this is where I want to take a 300 square home made out of hempcrete. And that home, that picture you see on the right is a home that's just been built in the Kangaroo Valley. And Clara supplied the hempcrete to that, I understand. And what I want to do is compare a 300 square metre home, a hempcrete home, to a brick veneer home. So we put the hempcrete in between the studs. We compare it to the bricks, the gyprock, and the insulation to make that home just as passive as the hempcrete home. And so working on the total emissions from the farmer through to the building. And thank you very much, Bob Doyle, for all your great contributions there and the cost comparisons. It's been absolutely fantastic what he's offered there, and in this process of putting it together so we have a set scenario to compare to two houses, taking out a lot of the different complexities.
Winton, that's fabulous. I invite some questions if you're happy to take questions.